that might just warm your heart. Now let's begin. Struggling, single dad came to haul boxes, but the woman in heels said, "I've been waiting for you." The alarm buzzed at 5:00 a.m., as it did every morning without mercy or apology. Ethan Cole rubbed the grit from his eyes and swung his legs over the edge of the twin mattress, careful not to creak the old floorboards too loudly. Across the room beneath a heap of mismatched blankets, his daughter Lily stirred, but didn't wake. He smiled quietly to himself. At 10, she slept with the peace of someone untouched by the heaviness he carried in his chest every day. In the cramped kitchen of their rented duplex, Ethan cracked eggs into a pan, with the silent efficiency of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. Bacon sizzled low on the burner. He poured 2 glasses of orange juice, one in a plastic cup, the other in a chipped mug he'd had since his Navy days. This wasn't a home with excess. It was a home with enough. By the time Lily padded out in oversized pajamas, her hair a tousled halo breakfast was already on the table. "Morning, Daddy," she mumbled, slipping into her seat and rubbing her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart. Eat up. I've got a big job today." "Where to? Some house up on Hollow Ridge?" "Haven't been up there in years." Lily blinked. "Isn't that where the creepy mansion is?" Ethan chuckled. "Not creepy. Just old. Some city person's moving in. Probably tired of the noise, looking for peace and quiet." She nodded solemnly, as if she too understood the appeal of peace and quiet. He leaned over and kissed the top of her head. 10 minutes later, he kissed her again at the front door, watching as she disappeared into the neighbor's house. Mrs. Walker, a retired teacher who'd insisted on helping with Lily during work hours, waved cheerfully from the porch. A blessing in denim capri. Ethan climbed into his rusted-out Ford pickup, the suspension creaking under his weight. The September morning was cool fog still hugging the hills around the town. He turned on the heat and took a deep breath. His back ached, his knees protested. But work was work. The GPS led him out of town and up the winding hill road, lined with pine trees and fallen leaves. Hollow Ridge had once been the crown jewel of Maple Glen, home to the wealthiest families, the grandest homes. But after the textile plant closed 20 years ago, most of those houses sat empty or crumbled. As he drove past stone gates and moss-covered fences, he spotted it, the Whitmore estate. He hadn't heard that name in years. The mansion loomed like a relic from another time. Weather-worn shutters, ivy climbing up limestone walls. But as he pulled into the long circular driveway, he saw movement curtains drawn open, the faint glow of lamps through windows. Someone was home. He parked and reached into the back seat for his clipboard and gloves. The job order said 6 crates of sofa, 2 trunks, and a few odd-shaped boxes. Furniture delivery. No mention of who the client was. He climbed the wide stone steps to the front porch, the wooden boards groaning under his boots. He lifted his hand to knock, but the door opened before he could. A woman stood in the threshold, tall, composed red heels, clicking softly on the marble floor behind her. Her dark auburn hair was tied back in a simple twist, revealing a graceful neckline above a cashmere sweater. Her makeup was subtle, eyes sharp, watching him. Not like a stranger, but like someone who knew him. She smiled. "I've been waiting for you." Ethan stared, caught mid-breath. The voice stirred something faint and forgotten in the recesses of his memory. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he asked, stepping back slightly, clipboard in hand. She stepped forward, the scent of lavender and old books brushing against the morning air. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Her face was familiar, but Ethan couldn't place it. "I'm Grace," she said gently. "Grace Whitmore." And just like that, the past punched through him like a gust of wind through an open window. High school junior year. The quiet girl in the back row who wore her father's bruises like shadows under her sleeves. The one who disappeared without a word, the summer before senior year. He hadn't seen her in over 2 decades. "You?" He began, then stopped. "You lived here, I did, and now I do again." He blinked still, holding the clipboard as though it could shield him from memory. "Small town, I guess everyone comes back eventually." "Not everyone," she said, smiling softly, "just the ones who left too soon." Ethan nodded, unsure what to say. He'd never been good with words, especially not when they reached deep like this. He cleared his throat and held up the form. "So, I'm here for the delivery." "I know," she said. You always did show up when it mattered." Before he could respond, she turned and led him into the house. The air inside was a mix of cedar wood and restoration paint still drying in places, drop cloths scattered across the floor. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting soft shadows across old furniture. Grace pointed him toward the parlor, where the boxes were to be placed. He worked in silence, arms straining under the weight boots, thudding against hardwood. She watched him from a distance, occasionally offering a bottle of water or asking if he needed help. He always declined. Finally, as he lowered the last trunk, she broke the silence. "You shared your lunch with me once," she said. "He turned, I was 14. Ran away that morning, sat behind the garage, behind your dad's shop for hours. You found me, didn't say anything, just handed me half your sandwich and told me where the bus stop was." Ethan looked at her stunned. "I never forgot that," she added. He shifted uncomfortably. "It was just a sandwich to you?" Maybe he didn't know what to say. The weight in the room wasn't the crates anymore. It was something else entirely. Grace walked to the fireplace, her voice quieter. "Sometimes the smallest kindness is the only thing that gets you through." He stood there still for a long moment. Then he picked up his gloves. "I should get going," he said. She nodded, but her eyes held his like a question left unanswered. "Thanks for the help." "Ethan," he turned at the door. "You remembered my name." "I told you," she said. "I've been waiting for you." And as the door clicked shut behind him, Ethan Cole knew this job wasn't going to be just another morning. It was the beginning of something he hadn't dared hope for in a very long time. The engine of Ethan's truck growled down Hollow Ridge Road, but his mind wasn't in the driver's seat. The wheels on the pavement were steady, but his thoughts kept veering off course into the past, into memories he hadn't summoned in decades. Grace Whitmore. That name had once belonged to a girl with haunted eyes and bruises she tried to hide under long sleeves. She rarely spoke at school. When she did, her voice was so soft that teachers leaned in to hear her. She never came to football games, never joined clubs, never laughed like the others. And then one summer she was just gone. People whispered. Some said she ran away. Some said her father sent her off. No one really knew. And in a small town like Maple Glen, unanswered questions quickly became folklore, then forgetfulness. But she remembered him. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter. He hadn't thought much about that day behind his father's garage in years. He was 17, just off his shift, wolfing down a ham and cheese sandwich when he saw her curled up against a stack of tires, shaking her face blotchy from crying. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't pry. He simply tore his sandwich in two and handed her half along with his father's thermos of sweet tea. After a few minutes, she whispered, "Where's the bus stop?" He pointed. She left, that was all. Until this morning. Now she was back in the same house her family had once ruled over, like royalty, standing with calm grace, and dressed like she had stepped out of a Manhattan Loft magazine. But it was her eyes that unsettled him the most. They weren't the eyes of someone returning home by chance. They were eyes that chose to come back. And she said she'd been waiting for him. Dad Lily's voice brought him back. He blinked and realized he was parked in front of Mrs. Walker's house. His little girl was already running down the steps, backpack bouncing behind her, a peanut butter smile on her face. He got out and opened the passenger door. "How was your day, Bug? We read Charlotte's Web, and I got to be Wilbur," she said proudly as she buckled in. "Guess what? I squealed like a real pig." He laughed, ruffling her hair. "That's my girl." But even as he pulled away from the curb and listened to her chatter, part of him remained back at that house on the hill with the woman who hadn't forgotten a single detail. That night, after Lily fell asleep mid-sentence during a bedtime story, Ethan lingered by her door a little longer. She looked like her mother when she slept, peaceful, untouchable. He pressed a kiss to her forehead and turned off the lamp. Downstairs, he sat at the tiny kitchen table, an open beer warming in his hand, unopened mail scattered beside it. He stared at nothing for a long time. Then he reached for his phone. The contact page was empty. No Grace Whitmore. Of course not. She probably had an assistant and a landline that rang into marble halls. What would he even say? "Hi, I'm the guy who gave you half a sandwich 25 years ago. Thanks for remembering." He shook his head and stood up. Before bed, he pulled out the old photo album from under his closet. Dust rose as he flipped through the pages: birthdays, fishing trips, high school football snapshots, and there, wedged between prom pictures and a yellowing yearbook clipping, was a Polaroid. A blurry garage, a boy in a grease-stained shirt, and in the background, barely visible, a girl sitting on the ground, holding something wrapped in foil. He hadn't realized she was in that shot, but she was. The next morning, Ethan was back on the schedule. More hauling a small apartment downtown, easier job, less emotional landmines, just the way he liked it. Until his supervisor waved him over after lunch. "You're heading back to the Whitmore estate?" the man said, checking his tablet. "Same client requested you specifically." Ethan paused. "Did she say why?" The man shrugged. "Didn't ask rich folks. You know how they are?" He didn't argue. Instead, he got back in the truck, heart a little heavier, hands a little tenser. He hadn't expected to see her again so soon. As he climbed the ridge road once more, the sky darkened with approaching clouds. The house looked different in this light, less glamorous, more vulnerable. Like it too carried ghosts behind the stone walls. Grace met him at the door again, but this time she wore jeans and a flannel shirt. Still beautiful, still composed, but more human. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing him in. "I found a few more boxes in the attic." "No problem," he said, stepping inside. "That's what I'm here for." He followed her up creaking stairs, down narrow hallways, past rooms filled with antique furniture and echoes. In one room, sunlight fell across a stack of dusty boxes. Ethan crouched beside them, assessing their weight. As he worked, Grace lingered near the window. "Do you remember what I said yesterday?" Ethan hesitated. "About the sandwich?" She smiled faintly. "Yes, but more than that." He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You said you've been waiting for me." "I have," she said softly. "Not in some grand romantic way. Just, I came back to this house to face things I ran from. But part of me always remembered that day behind your dad's shop. That quiet kindness, no judgment, just presence." He didn't know what to say. Words felt too small. "I spent most of my adult life in cities that applauded noise," she continued. "But here it's the silence that tells the truth. And I guess I wanted to say thank you." Properly, Ethan's voice when it came was low and honest. "You don't owe me anything, Grace." "Maybe not," she replied. "But sometimes it's not about debt, it's about honoring what mattered." There was a pause, a long, quiet, sacred pause. Then from the hallway, a quiet voice piped up. "Daddy Lily." Ethan turned in surprise. "Bug, what are you doing here?" Mrs. Walker stepped into view behind her. "I thought you could use a ride home," she said, smiling at Grace. And this little one was eager to come along. Lily's eyes lit up when she saw Grace. "Are you the lady who writes books?" she asked. Grace knelt to her level, her eyes twinkling. "I am, and I hear you're a pretty great storyteller yourself." Lily beamed. Ethan glanced between them, something tightening gently in his chest. This wasn't what he expected. But maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what he needed. And Grace, watching father and daughter with a quiet smile, felt something settle inside her. She hadn't felt in years. A beginning. It had been 2 weeks since Ethan's first delivery to the Whitmore estate. And since then, Grace had found reasons, plausible, polite reasons, to request his help again. A wobbly bookshelf here, a stuck window there, a garden fence in need of repair. Ethan told himself he was just doing his job, just being neighborly, just being helpful. But something had shifted. It wasn't just the work, it was the pauses between the work, the way she stood by the porch, handing him a cold lemonade, without needing to fill the silence, or how Lily always lit up when Grace stopped by with a new book or homemade muffins. Grace had slowly begun to appear in the rhythm of their days, like sunlight, warming a room not through the front door, but from a forgotten window. Today, Ethan was fixing a cracked step on Grace's front porch. He crouched low with a drill and wood putty sweat darkening the back of his shirt. Grace sat nearby in a rocking chair, barefoot, for once her heels abandoned on the stone ledge. She watched him work with a kind of quiet curiosity that made Ethan nervous. Not because he was uncomfortable, but because he liked it. "Did you always do this kind of work?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. "Not always," he replied without looking up. Used to be a mechanic. Before that, a Marine. Really, her voice lifted with genuine interest. How long? 8 years stationed out west, then 2 tours overseas. Got out when Lily was born. He glanced up briefly and saw something flicker across her face, an emotion too quick to catch. Admiration, respect. Maybe something deeper. And her mom, she asked gently. The question wasn't intrusive. It felt necessary. Human Ethan sat back on his heels, wiping his brow with his forearm. Claire. We met not long after I got out. She was a nurse, smarter than me by a mile. Made me laugh without trying. Grace smiled softly. She sounds lovely. She was, he said, then added cancer. Hit us out of nowhere. She was gone before Lily turned 5. There was a long, respectful silence. I'm sorry, Ethan. He nodded as if accepting something, both distant and ever-present. I think she knew that she didn't have long. She used to say, "You're going to do just fine, Ethan Cole. You've got more heart than you think." Grace looked away toward the trees at the edge of the property. Her voice dropped. You do have heart, more than you realize. Ethan didn't respond. Compliments made him uneasy, not because he didn't appreciate them, but because he didn't believe them easily. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you remember the night your dad's shop got broken into? Ethan blinked. You mean senior year? Yeah, why I was hiding behind that dumpster, she said quietly. The night it happened, he stared at her, unsure if he heard correctly. I'd run away. My father had hit me again. But that night was worse than usual. I didn't know where to go, so I went back to the garage. I remembered you worked there. It felt safe. Ethan stood slowly, the step forgotten for a moment. I didn't know, he said. You weren't supposed to. I was trying not to be seen. But you came out anyway, carrying that sandwich like it was no big deal. It was no big deal. No, she said firmly, meeting his eyes. It was everything. You didn't ask questions. You didn't treat me like I was broken. You just gave me something warm and pointed me in the right direction. Ethan looked away, emotion tightening his throat. Grace continued, her voice soft but unwavering. I took the night bus to Chicago. I had $26 in a backpack. I slept in libraries, shelters, wherever I could. Eventually got a GED, waited tables, applied to a community college. You did all that, he asked, stunned. And then some, she said with a faint smile. Worked through grad school, started writing, first book didn't sell. Second one barely did, but the third New York Times bestseller. And every time they asked me in interviews, what gave you the courage to start? I thought about that sandwich, about the kindness of someone who didn't expect anything in return. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Funny, he said. At last, I always thought I didn't do enough. You did more than you'll ever know. She stood now, walking over to him. For the first time, they stood close, not just as neighbors or acquaintances, but as people stripped of time and memory, facing each other fully. You saved me, she said. He exhaled slowly. And you're saving me right back. Grace tilted her head. Am I? You're bringing Lily joy again. She hasn't smiled like that since Claire. And you, Ethan, met her gaze. You're reminding me that life isn't done with me yet. The air between them changed, softened, deepened. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was the unmistakable opening of something rare. The beginning of healing, not through grand gestures, but through shared truth. Just then, Lily's voice echoed from the driveway. Daddy, look what Mrs. Walker gave me. Ethan stepped off the porch just as Lily ran up, holding a basket of apples. We can make pie, she announced. Grace grinned. Apple pie's my specialty. Lily's eyes widened. Really, can we, Daddy? Can we bake with Miss Grace? Ethan hesitated for only a second. Then he smiled. Only if she lets me do the dishes. Grace laughed, a sound that felt like autumn wind through open windows. And in that golden afternoon light, something unspoken settled gently between them. The beginning of trust, the beginning of something. They didn't need to name it yet. Some things, like old wounds and new hopes, needed time to bloom. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and apples, and the laughter of a little girl echoed through the halls of the Whitmore house, sounds the old place hadn't heard in years. Grace stood by the counter, her sleeves rolled up, and her auburn hair pinned back in a loose bun. She watched as Lily carefully spooned the apple mixture into the pie crust, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. "You're a natural," Grace said, handing her the top layer of dough. "Now lay that over gently. Just like that." Perfect. Lily beamed, cheeks flushed with joy. "Can we do the crisscross thingy, like on the cooking shows?" Grace grinned. "The lattice." Of course. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, just watching. There was something deeply calming about the scene in front of him. His daughter glowing with happiness, and Grace so effortlessly fitting into a space he hadn't realized was vacant. This, whatever this was, felt real. He stepped into the room. "Need a dishwasher?" Yet soon Grace replied, giving him a sideways glance. "But first, the most important part of the process." "What's that taste testing?" Lily chimed in. Grace dipped a spoon into the filling and handed it to Ethan. He took a bite, eyebrows lifting in pleasant surprise. "That's dangerous," he said. Grace's smile softened. "Don't blame the baker." As the pie baked, the three of them moved into the living room. Lily curled up in the oversized armchair with a book Grace had given her earlier that week. Ethan sat on the couch, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "I can't remember the last time she was this light," he said quietly. Grace turned toward him. "She carries more than most kids her age, but she's strong. She gets that from you." He looked at her, unsure how to respond. He was used to being acknowledged for his work ethic, his dependability, not his parenting, not his heart. Outside, wind rattled the windows. The autumn storm had rolled in quicker than expected, bringing heavy rain and a sudden drop in temperature. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Lily looked up from her book. "Do you think the power will go out?" "It might," Ethan said. "But we've got candles and flashlights and pie." Grace added, "Best kind of emergency." Lily replied with a giggle. Minutes later, as if summoned by her words, the lights flickered, then went out entirely. Grace moved quickly, lighting a few tall candles from the mantel. Their glow bathed the room in golden warmth. "I guess we're officially having an adventure," she said. Ethan found an old flashlight in a drawer. "This house has probably seen 100 storms like this." Grace nodded, but never with guess. They sat together in the flickering light, listening to the wind howl outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, and for a moment the world outside seemed very far away. Lily had drifted to sleep under a thick blanket. Ethan gently carried her to the guest room, down the hall where Grace had already turned down the covers. He tucked his daughter in, brushing a curl from her forehead. She barely stirred. When he returned, Grace was sitting by the fire, her knees drawn up under her chin. Her face was lit only by flame, and for the first time since he'd seen her again, she looked not polished, not composed, but real vulnerable. He sat beside her. "This house always felt haunted to me," she said after a long pause. "Even when I was a kid, not with ghosts, but with silence. My father didn't speak unless he was angry. My mother left before I was 10, and I learned early not to make too much noise." Ethan said nothing, only listened. "I used to write stories in the attic." She continued. "I'd make up families who laughed together, mothers who stayed dads, who built things instead of breaking them. It was the only way I knew how to imagine a different life." He looked at her, the flickering light catching the sheen in her eyes. "You wrote your way into the world," he said quietly. She nodded, "But the world I really wanted was always here." Thunder cracked in the distance. Grace shivered. Without thinking, Ethan reached over and draped the throw blanket over her shoulders. Her hand brushed his. She didn't pull away. "Why did you really come back?" he asked gently. Her eyes found his. "Because I needed to know if this place, if I could ever be more than what I ran from." "And I'm still figuring it out," she said. "But lately, I feel less like I'm running." Ethan let the silence stretch. Let it say the things neither of them quite could. Then she turned to him and said, "You know, I never imagined this. This you and Lily. A storm of pie. It's all so ordinary, and it's exactly what I've missed most." Ethan felt the warmth of her words settle in his chest like a fire that had been waiting for kindling. He didn't speak. Not right away. Words weren't his first language, acts were. So he stood, walked into the kitchen, and returned with 2 forks and the still warm pie wrapped in a dish towel. No storm should go without dessert, he said. Grace laughed, a soft, surprised sound that felt like a melody. They sat there, two forks, one pie between them, the storm raging on while the world inside that room grew quiet and full. Not empty, not haunted, full. And as the candlelight flickered against the walls and the rain tapped gently on the windows, Ethan realized something rare had happened. In the most unexpected place, on a night carved out of wind and memory, they had both found something they didn't know they were missing. A home. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt reverent. Outside, the sky was the pale blue of early morning, and the trees glistened from the night's rain like they'd been baptized. The Whitmore estate sat still and dignified atop Hollow Ridge, as if it had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. Inside the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon still lingered faintly from the night before. Ethan stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, slicing apples with a practiced hand. Grace leaned beside him, watching him work, arms folded lightly. Lily sat at the table, swinging her legs and humming a tune from a cartoon she half remembered. It had become their Saturday ritual, though none of them had ever said so aloud. Each weekend, Ethan found his way back to the house on the hill with a toolbox or a grocery bag or a pie tin, and somehow they always ended up here in this kitchen, shoulder to shoulder, laughter weaving through the morning like sunlight. Thin slices, Ethan asked. Very, Grace replied. You're not building a fort, you're baking a pie. He gave her a side glance, lips twitching. I've got many skills, forts just happen to be one of them. Lily giggled, Grace grinned, pleased, noted. They worked in rhythm. Grace mixing spices, Lily stealing sugar cubes, Ethan rolling the dough with the slow patience of someone who found peace in manual labor. There was music on in the background, soft jazz from Grace's ancient radio. The scratchy melody seemed to belong to the house, as though it had always played there even when no one was listening. Ethan wiped his hands on a dish towel. You know, Claire never liked baking. She said it made too much of a mess. Grace looked up, surprised by the sudden mention of his late wife. She was probably right, Grace said gently. But sometimes the mess is the best part. He nodded, thoughtful. Claire liked order. She had this way of folding the laundry that was borderline military. I imagine she had to being married to a Marine. Ethan chuckled, fair point. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable but honest. Grace watched him, noting the quiet way his grief lived inside him. Not as a wound, but as a part of his structure, like a tree that had grown around a nail. I never asked, Grace said after a moment. Why hauling? Why this job? Ethan shrugged. It pays, it's steady. Doesn't ask me to sit behind a desk or smile when I don't feel like it. She tilted her head. But you're more than that, I can tell. He looked at her, the corner of his mouth quirking. You give compliments like they're facts. Maybe they are. He studied her for a second. What about you? Why'd you stop writing? The question landed gently but deeply. Grace glanced down at her hands dusted with flour. I didn't stop, she said softly. I just paused. For how long? Almost 2 years now. He raised an eyebrow. Writer's block. Not exactly. After my third book came out, people started expecting things from me. More stories, more tours, more sparkle. I lost the part of writing that was mine. I was performing instead of telling the truth, and this place helps with that. Grace looked around the kitchen, her gaze lingering on Lily, who was now doodling on a notepad beside the bowl of apples. I think I came back here to remember who I was before anyone expected anything of me. Ethan leaned on the counter. And have you almost? She smiled at him, soft, grateful, open before he could say anything more. Lily looked up. Daddy, can we read on the porch after the pie's in the oven? Sure, sweetheart, Grace interjected. Only if you promise to leave a piece of pie for me? Lily giggled. Maybe. They all laughed, and for a brief, shining moment, the world felt perfectly simple. Later that afternoon, the three of them sat on the wide wraparound porch, wrapped in flannel throws. Grace read aloud from an old book of folk tales, her voice melodic and calm. Lily rested against Ethan's side, eyes half closed but listening intently. A breeze rustled the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang the hour. Grace closed the book. That one always makes me cry, she whispered. Why? Ethan asked. Because it's about a girl who was lost in the woods and everyone kept passing her by until someone finally stopped. He glanced at her, knowing that wasn't just a story to her. I used to believe that no one would ever stop, she said quietly. Ethan was silent for a beat. Then he said, well, someone did. She met his eyes. Yes, she said he did. They didn't speak again for a long while. The wind moved through the trees like an unseen hand, and the golden light of late afternoon spilled across the porch like honey. Eventually, Lily broke the silence. Miss Grace. Yes, sweetie. Do you ever wish you had kids? Grace blinked, startled by the question. I mean, Lily continued, you're really good at it, reading and baking and all that. You'd be a great mom. Grace swallowed, her voice gentle. I think if things had been different, I would have liked that. Ethan looked at her, then really looked, not as someone passing through, not as a childhood memory, but as a woman standing quietly in the present, strong enough to come home, brave enough to stay. Grace reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind Lily's ear. Well, she said softly, I didn't get to have kids of my own, but I'm very lucky to know you. Lily beamed. You can be like my extra mom. Ethan smiled, but his heart skipped a beat. And Grace ever so quietly whispered, I'd like that very much. That evening after Ethan and Lily had gone home, Grace stood in the empty kitchen. The last sliver of pie sat on the counter untouched. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like it was waiting for something. She walked upstairs to her writing room, turned on the lamp, and opened her notebook. For the first time in 2 years, she picked up her pen. At the top of the page, she wrote, The man who rolled out dough like he was steadying the world, and beneath it, the girl who reminded me why softness matters. She paused, then added one more line. This is how it begins, and it had. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass window above the staircase, scattering fractured colors across the polished floorboards. Grace descended the stairs slowly, barefoot, coffee in hand, feeling the hush of a house that remembered both laughter and loss. For the first time in her adult life, she had slept through the night without waking from dreams that dragged her back to the past. It felt like progress. She was halfway through her second sip of coffee when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Through the front window, she saw a black SUV idling in the circular drive. Her stomach tightened, not with fear exactly, but with something colder, older. A memory rising from below, the man standing on her porch wore a tailored charcoal suit, sunglasses despite the morning light, and a condescending smirk that hadn't changed since they were kids. Hello, little sister. Grace's voice was even Patrick. He took off his sunglasses, revealing pale gray eyes that had always seemed to look through people rather than at them. Nice place. You finally got around to fixing it up. She didn't move aside to let him in. Why are you here? He looked past her into the hallway. Thought I'd see how the prodigal daughter was doing. You haven't cared about that since Mom left. Patrick tisked under his breath. Still holding on to old grudges, I see. You always were the dramatic one. Grace didn't flinch. She'd spent a lifetime building walls. She wasn't about to let this man chip them down in a single conversation. If you came for money, she said, you're wasting your time. Patrick raised both hands in mock innocence. I just wanted to talk. We're family. She gave a humorless laugh. You were family the day you locked me out in the snow and told Dad I stole from his wallet. That was 30 years ago, and yet you've never once apologized. He tilted his head. You always needed a villain. Grace. But maybe the problem wasn't everyone else. Before she could answer, a small voice echoed from down the hallway. Miss Grace. Lily Grace turned swiftly, her expression softening. Hey, sweetheart, what are you doing here so early? Lily patted in still, in her pink hoodie, clutching a book. Dad had a flat tire. Mrs. Walker dropped me off so I wouldn't miss your blueberry pancakes. Grace knelt to her level and smiled. Well, lucky for you, I happen to have just enough blueberries left. Patrick stared at the girl, then at Grace. You're playing house now, he asked. Grace stood slowly. Leave, Grace. I said leave. Now her voice carried such quiet finality that even Patrick hesitated. Then he smirked, shrugged, and stepped back toward the porch. Be careful, Gracie, he said as he slid his sunglasses back on. You let people get too close and they see what you're really made of. She watched him go until the SUV disappeared down the hill. Behind her, Lily asked, Was that your brother?" Grace nodded. "He seems mean." Grace managed a small smile. "He's complicated, but he made your face look like you were gonna cry." Grace crouched again and took Lily's hands in hers. "You're very observant. Are you okay?" Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "I will be." Later that morning, Ethan arrived with grease on his hands and an apology on his lips. "I didn't mean to dump her on you last minute. She's never a burden," Grace said. "Besides, she saved me from a rather unpleasant visitor." Ethan raised a brow. "My brother," she explained. "The only person I've ever truly been afraid of, even as an adult." Ethan's face darkened. "Do I need to have a talk with him?" The edge in his voice surprised her in a good way. "No," she said, "I already did." They stood in the hallway, the morning light cutting across Ethan's shoulder. Grace looked at him, then really looked. Not just the man who fixed things, not just Lily's father, but someone steady, someone who saw people even when they didn't want to be seen. "I spent years trying to be the opposite of my family," she said, "so much so that I forgot I get to define myself." He nodded, slow and quiet. "That's something I understand." She tilted her head. "Do you?" Ethan hesitated. "After Claire passed, people stopped looking me in the eye, like I might break if they said her name. I think they thought I was strong because I didn't talk about it. But the truth is, I was just surviving. That's not the same as living." She reached out, gently touched his arm. "You're living now." He looked down at her hand, then back into her eyes. "I think I am." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of Lily's voice from the kitchen. "The pancakes are turning brown." "Is that good or bad?" Grace smiled and called back. "That's when they're best." She turned to Ethan, who looked at her with a softness that startled her more than any of Patrick's words. "You sure you're okay?" he asked one last time. She exhaled deeply for the first time in a long time. Yes. That afternoon, while Lily napped on the couch, and the scent of maple syrup still lingered in the air, Grace sat at her writing desk and opened a new document on her laptop. Title: Wounds That Don't Show. She didn't write for publication this time. She wrote for herself. She wrote about girls who were ignored and women who came home. She wrote about storms in kitchens and laughter blooming in unexpected places. And as her fingers flew across the keyboard, she thought of Ethan's voice in the hallway, low and solid. "You're living now." Outside, the wind picked up. The season was shifting, and so was she. But this time she wasn't afraid. This time she knew she had someone beside her who wouldn't run when things got hard. Someone who would stay. The air on Hollow Ridge had changed. The scent of fallen leaves lingered like a secret, and the maples had begun to wear their October colors, bold crimsons and bright golds, that flamed across the hilltops like brushstrokes from a braver time. Grace stood in the backyard of the Whitmore estate, her boots buried in grass still damp from last night's dew. She held pruning shears in one hand and a bundle of lavender in the other, but she hadn't moved in several minutes. She was staring at the garden. It was wild, overgrown, almost forgotten, but not to her. This had once been her mother's domain, a sanctuary carved out behind a house filled with shouts and slammed doors. When her father had raged, her mother had disappeared among the flowers, trimming rose bushes like she was sculpting silence. Grace used to watch her from the attic window, hands pressed to the glass. Now she was here in the same spot, holding the same shears. But the woman who'd once fled this ground with only a backpack and a notebook had become someone different. Stronger, wiser, not unscathed, but not broken either. A twig snapped behind her. She turned to see Lily coming down the steps, clutching her favorite book cheeks, pink from the morning chill. "Miss Grace," she said breathlessly, "can we read out here today?" "Of course," Grace smiled and pointed to the sun-warmed bench by the lilac tree. "That's the best seat in the house." Lily ran ahead, dropping her book with a soft thud on the bench. Grace followed, trailing lavender in memory. As they sat together, Lily leaned against her side, eyes fixed on the page as Grace began to read aloud. But before she could get through the second paragraph, Lily looked up. "Did you really grow up in this house?" "I did. And your mom lived here too?" "Yes," Grace said. She loved this garden. She used to call it her escape hatch. Escape from what? Grace hesitated. "From things that hurt." Lily seemed to think about that. "That's why I like books. They're like magic doors. You go through them and you don't feel the bad stuff so much. Grace placed an arm around her shoulder. That's exactly right. They sat in silence after that, not reading anymore, just listening to the wind move through the leaves. Then Lily asked very softly, "Why did you leave?" It was such a simple question, but it landed deep. Grace didn't answer right away. The answer wasn't simple. Not then, not now. She ran her fingers along the spine of the book. Because I didn't feel safe. Because of your dad. Yes, and because sometimes when people you love don't protect you, it's hard to believe anyone ever will. Lily turned to her. But you came back. Grace looked at the child beside her, the girl who had wormed her way into her days with sticky fingers and big questions, and a laugh that sounded like hope. Yes, she said. I came back to see if something good could still grow here. That afternoon after Lily had gone home with Ethan, Grace walked the perimeter of the property. She passed the old oak tree where she'd once buried her first short story in a mason jar. She passed the shed where her father used to sharpen tools with a cigarette dangling from his mouth. And finally she stopped in front of the rusted gate that led to the side yard, long overgrown and barely visible under the brush. She opened it, wincing at the creak, and stepped through. What she saw stopped her breath. The old swing still there. Its ropes were frayed, its seat half rotted, but it swayed gently in the breeze like it remembered her. She walked closer, touched the wood with a kind of reverence. This was where she'd sat the night before. She ran away 14 years old. Face swollen from a slap, knees scraped, a notebook tucked under her arm like armor. That night she had wished for one thing, not rescue, not even revenge, just kindness, and it had come. In the form of a boy with oil on his hands and a sandwich in his pocket, a boy named Ethan Cole. She leaned her forehead against the swing's rope and let herself feel it, all the pain, the remembering, the impossible grace of surviving. Then from behind her, a familiar voice. You okay? She turned, heart leaping just slightly. Ethan stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes soft. You're not supposed to sneak up on people like that, she teased gently. You look like you were a million miles away. She gestured to the swing. I kinda was. He stepped closer. I used to sit in the back of math class, wondering what it would be like to talk to you. She smiled. Why didn't you? You were quiet and I was stupid. You weren't stupid, she said, then added, just covered in axle grease. He chuckled, then looked at her with a seriousness that settled into the air between them. I came up here because Lily asked if you'd ever come visit us. Grace's heart thudded. Did she? She thinks the house needs your stories? Grace nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. That little girl's changing me. She's good at that, Ethan said. So was Claire. At the mention of his late wife, a quiet fell over them. Grace spoke gently. Do you think she'd be okay with all this me-us? He considered that. I think, he said slowly, Claire believed in second chances. She'd want me to live again, and she'd want Lily to see that love doesn't die when someone's gone. It just looks different. Grace's eyes shimmered. Then Ethan said, You asked once if anything good could still grow here. I think you're growing it. Every day she stepped toward him. Then stay, she said. Stay for a while. I'm not going anywhere, he replied. And for the first time in her life, she believed someone when they said those words. That night, Grace sat at her writing desk and opened her laptop again. She began a new chapter. Not of a novel, of her life. The old garage sat like a forgotten relic at the edge of town, just off the service road that ran parallel to the abandoned railway tracks. It had once been the pride of the Cole family, a father and son operation with grease under every nail and a pot of coffee that never went empty. Ethan hadn't stepped inside in over 6 years. Not since his father died. Not since everything else changed. Now he stood in front of it again, hands on his hips. Lily bouncing at his side, her ponytail bobbing with each excited step. Is this where Grandpa used to work? She asked, eyes wide. He nodded. And me too. Before you were even a twinkle. She squinted at him. What's a twinkle? He laughed. It means a long time ago. The roof sagged slightly on the left side and a panel of siding was missing from the rear wall. The windows were covered in grime. but the bones were good. The garage was tired, not broken, kind of like him. Grace had been the one to suggest it. Over lunch one afternoon, as Lily played nearby with sidewalk chalk, she had said it like a thought that had been growing roots for a while. Have you ever thought about fixing up the garage? Starting something again? For you, Ethan had shrugged at the time, noncommittal, but he hadn't stopped thinking about it since. Now here he was. He pulled a rusted key from his pocket, the one he'd kept on a nail behind his current fridge, not knowing why he hadn't thrown it away. He slid it into the lock it stuck, then gave with a reluctant click. The door groaned open. The smell hit first old oil, dry dust, the faint tang of forgotten tools. A workbench still lined the back wall, cluttered with rusted bolts and a cracked vise. The outline of his father's calendar, a woman in a red bathing suit holding a wrench, was still faintly visible on the peeling drywall. Lily stepped inside behind him. "It smells funny," she whispered. "Smells like memories," Ethan replied. They walked the length of the shop, slow and quiet. He saw everything through her eyes, the mess, the shadows, the sense of something lost waiting to be found. "What would you do with it?" "Daddy," she asked. He looked around. "Fix cars, maybe. Teach kids how to change a tire. Get some of the high school boys off the street." She tugged at his hand. "That sounds important." He smiled. "I think it is." Later that afternoon, Grace met them at the garage. She wore jeans and work gloves, a red bandana holding back her hair. In one arm, she carried a cardboard tray with 3 milkshakes and a box of sandwiches. "This place is begging to come back to life," she said, stepping through the doorway with a kind of reverence, "You think?" Ethan asked. She walked to the old workbench and ran her fingers across its surface. "It has character, it has grit, and it has you." Ethan looked at her sideways. That a compliment, the highest kind. They sat on the concrete steps out front, sipping milkshakes and watching the late afternoon sun paint the sidewalk gold. "I've thought about teaching again," he said suddenly. Grace turned to him. "Really not in a classroom," he clarified. "Just teaching real things. How to change oil. How to keep a car from stalling in winter. Stuff no one learns anymore." "I think that's beautiful," he chuckled. "Beautiful's not the word I'd use for brake fluid." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "Maybe not, but giving people a reason to believe in themselves again?" "That's beautiful." He didn't answer, but he reached over and took her hand. They sat there for a long time, watching as the town around them moved in quiet, everyday rhythms, people going home from work, dogs barking in distant yards, the hum of possibility lingering in the air. Over the next week, the garage became their project. Ethan cleared out the old tools, cleaned the floor with industrial soap, and patched the leaky roof with help from a couple of local veterans who'd heard about what he was doing and wanted to pitch in. Grace brought coffee and lunch every day, sometimes with Lily in tow, sometimes alone. She painted the exterior trim a cheerful barn red, ignoring the paint flecks that landed on her jeans and freckles. On Friday, a group of teenagers wandered by, 3 boys from the high school, curious and skeptical. "You fixing this place up?" one asked. Ethan nodded. "You ever change a spark plug?" "No, want to learn." The boy hesitated, then shrugged. Sure, by the end of the afternoon, all 3 had their hands covered in grease and wore looks of cautious pride. Grace watched from the corner, arms crossed, smiling softly. "You're building something here," she told Ethan that night as they sat in the truck, doors open, listening to the cicadas hum. He nodded. "Feels like it." She turned toward him. "Do you see it now? See what the man you are?" He looked at her long and searching. "I do, when you're around." She leaned in, kissed his cheek, just the edge of his jaw. It was brief. It was enough. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table long after Lily had gone to bed. In front of him lay a notebook, a blank one Grace had given him. For ideas, she'd said. He picked up a pen and wrote across the top of the first page, "Cole's Garage, a place to start over." And beneath it, "Maybe things don't have to be what they were. Maybe they can be better." He closed the notebook. Tomorrow, he'd hang a new sign out front. But tonight, he let the quiet wrap around him, not like loneliness, but like peace. Like the beginning of something he didn't even know he'd been waiting for. October ended with fire-colored leaves swirling in the gutters and mist curling along the sidewalks in the early morning. The town of Maple Glen began preparing for winter in quiet, ordinary ways. Storm windows replaced screen doors in grocery stores, stocked extra cans of soup and rock salt. But inside Ethan, the changing season carried a shift he hadn't expected. It began with silence. Grace hadn't answered his text the night before. Not like her, she wasn't the type to leave things hanging. They had fallen into a rhythm: coffee in the morning, check-ins throughout the day, sometimes even dinner if the stars aligned. But now it had been 24 hours, and silence was beginning to speak louder than words. At the garage, Ethan checked his phone again. Still nothing. Lily sat on a stool beside the tool bench, twirling a lug nut like it was a toy. "Is Miss Grace coming today?" she asked Ethan. Paused. "I don't know." Lily tilted her head. "Did something happen?" He forced a smile. "I'm not sure, sweetheart." But deep down he knew something had shifted. Grace stood in front of her mirror, the final suitcase zipped and waiting by the door. Her eyes looked tired. Her hair, usually tied with a touch of softness, was pinned into something more formal now. And she was dressed in the kind of tailored gray coat that belonged to the Grace Whitmore of New York, efficient, accomplished, unreachable. The call from her agent had come 2 days ago. A prestigious publishing house was hosting a private retreat in Vermont. Just 12 writers chosen for their distinctive voice and transformative impact. It was the kind of offer her former self would have leapt at. Except, this Grace hesitated, but the invitation had been insistent. "You're overdue," the agent had said. "This is where your name belongs." And so she had accepted out of obligation, out of curiosity, out of fear that if she didn't, she might never reclaim the part of her that once thrived in rooms like those. She scribbled a note and set it on the kitchen table. "Ethan, I needed to go. Just for a little while. Don't wait, just live." Grace? It wasn't enough. It wasn't fair. But it was all she had the strength to write. Ethan read the note with Lily at his side. She stood there in her fleece jacket, one mitten, missing the beginnings of a frown on her lips. "She left," Lily asked. He folded the paper slowly. "Just for a little while." "Why didn't she say goodbye?" Ethan crouched beside her. "Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to say hard things." Lily looked down. "I would have said goodbye." "I know, Bug." They stood there, the two of them, in the echoing entryway of Grace's house. It didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a museum of something warm that had just gone cold. Lily took Ethan's hand. "Do you think she's coming back?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted, and that answer sat heavier than he expected. That evening, Ethan found himself alone in the garage. The boys from the high school had already gone home, leaving behind the faint smell of oil and the slow creak of settling tools. The quiet wrapped around him, and for the first time in weeks, he let it all surface. He missed her. He missed the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way her laughter came in bursts like wind chimes in a breeze. He missed her questions, her stillness, her way of listening without judgment. But more than anything, he missed what she made him feel. Hope. He reached for the notebook he'd been keeping under the counter. The one labeled Cole's Garage, a place to start over. He flipped past sketches, lesson plans, and doodles from Lily. On a fresh page he wrote, "Sometimes even the strongest people walk away. Sometimes they have to, but the ones who matter, they find their way back." He set the pen down, closed the book, and stared out the open garage door into the empty night. A week passed. Then Grace called once. Ethan didn't answer. Not out of anger, but because he didn't know what to say. And maybe he wasn't ready to hear her voice softened by guilt. Instead, he poured himself into the garage. He built a new workbench, installed a sign above the door. Cole's Community Garage. People from town started dropping by, single moms with rattling engines, teenagers curious about tools, retirees offering to help. It grew slowly, quietly, purposefully. But every time the bell over the door rang, a small part of him hoped it would be her, and it never was. One afternoon, Lily brought home a drawing she made at school. She handed it to Ethan proudly, her fingers smudged with marker ink. It showed the three of them, Ethan, Lily, and Grace, standing outside the garage, all holding wrenches and smiling, under a banner that read, "We fix things together." Ethan's throat tightened. "You think she'd like it?" Lily asked. He nodded. "I think she'd love it." He hung it up by the front desk of the garage, And every time he passed it, he looked at the smiling face Grace had been given in Lily's sketch. Bright eyes, warm smile, her hand holding theirs. And he wondered if she had any idea what she'd left behind. In Vermont, Grace sat at a long table with linen napkins and well-dressed editors nodding politely as a best-selling novelist spoke about reclaiming creative control. She listened, she smiled. She even offered insights of her own when pressed, but she didn't feel like herself. She felt like someone playing Grace Whitmore. That night alone in her hotel room, she stared at a blinking cursor on her laptop screen. The words wouldn't come. She opened her notebook, the same one she'd used since returning to Maple Glen. And on the last page she wrote, "I thought I had to go to remember who I was, but the truth is I already remembered. He reminded me." She closed the notebook. Tomorrow she'd go home. Because she was finally ready to admit something she hadn't been brave enough to say before. She hadn't left to find herself. She'd left because she was afraid she already had. The wind howled across Maple Glen that night, sending dry leaves skittering like whispers down the narrow streets. It was nearly midnight when Ethan jolted awake, the faint glow of the alarm clock blinking 12:03 in red against the dark. It wasn't a sound that had woken him. It was a feeling sharp and unshakable. Something was wrong. He swung his legs over the bed and moved down the hallway, bare feet silent on the hardwood. When he reached Lily's room, he didn't knock. He pushed the door open gently. She was curled into herself, a tangled knot of limbs and blankets, her face pale, shining with sweat. "Lily," he said softly, crouching beside her bed. She didn't answer. Her breath was ragged, shallow. When he touched her forehead, it was blazing hot. He didn't hesitate. Within minutes, he had her wrapped in a thick blanket, arms cradling her limp body as he carried her to the truck. The engine coughed to life, and he sped down the hill toward the urgent care clinic, knuckles white against the steering wheel. But halfway down the darkened main road, his phone buzzed on the seat beside him. Grace Whitmore. His breath caught. He stared at it, heart pounding, one hand on the wheel, one hand reaching. He picked up the phone. She spoke first. "Ethan, I know it's late and maybe I shouldn't be calling, but Grace..." He cut her off. Voice strained, "Lily's sick." There was a pause, then urgency snapped into her voice. "What happened?" "High fever. I'm heading to the clinic now. She's barely responding." "I'm 10 minutes away," Grace said immediately. "I'm coming to you." He opened his mouth to protest, to say no, to protect himself from more, coming and going, but all that came out was, "Okay." Then he hung up. He didn't question it. By the time Grace reached the clinic parking lot, Ethan was pacing outside, arms crossed, eyes shadowed with worry. The old pickup truck sat crookedly in the nearest spot, headlights still on driver's door open. She didn't speak. She just walked straight to him and placed a hand on his arm. "She's inside," she asked. He nodded. "They're running tests, said it's likely a viral spike, but she was nearly unresponsive when we got here." He stopped, his voice cracking. "I haven't seen her like that since Claire died." Grace's expression softened. "Ethan." "I didn't know who else to call," he whispered. Her hand tightened gently on his arm. "You didn't have to. I was already coming." Inside the sterile hallway, the white light buzzed overhead. Lily lay in a pediatric bed of faux hooked to her arm, a cool cloth pressed to her forehead. Her small chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm. Grace sat beside her, whispering softly, smoothing her hair. Ethan stood near the door, unsure where to put his hands, unsure how to hold himself together. He watched them, his daughter and the woman who, despite every reason to run, had turned back to them in the moment that mattered. Grace glanced up and caught his gaze. "You've done everything right," she said. "I wasn't enough," he said quietly. Her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? I let her get sick. I didn't see the signs. I'm supposed to keep her safe." "You have kept her safe," Grace said, rising from the chair. "You're here. You held her. You brought her in time. I couldn't even reach anyone." "You reached me," she said, stepping close, "and I came." He looked at her, then really looked, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, stubble dark on his jaw, his shirt wrinkled and damp with sweat. But he looked solid too, grounded, present. All the things Grace had been running from her entire life, and all the things she didn't realize she wanted until she walked away from them. "I thought I needed to go find the life I left behind," she said softly. But everything I was looking for was already here. He stared at her, barely breathing. I'm not going anywhere this time. Ethan, she whispered. Not unless you ask me to. His reply was rough, choked. I couldn't even if I tried. They sat side by side in the quiet room for the next hour, not saying much. Occasionally Lily would stir, and one of them would rise to check her IV adjust, her blanket stroke her cheek. When the nurse returned and confirmed that Lily's fever was finally breaking, Ethan exhaled for the first time in hours. Grace reached for his hand, and this time he didn't hesitate. He held her hand like it anchored him, and in a way it did. Just before dawn, with Lily sleeping peacefully and the clinic beginning to stir with morning life, Grace stood at the window watching the sun rise in pale streaks across the horizon. Ethan walked over, his voice quiet. You really came back. I really did. He nodded, then after a beat asked why Grace didn't answer right away. She just reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote this the night before I left Vermont, she said, handing it to him. He unfolded it slowly. I didn't leave because I stopped caring. I left because I was afraid of caring too much. But some things, some people are worth the fear. He looked up from the page, eyes filled with something deep and unspeakable. Then he said, come home with us. Grace blinked. Are you sure? He nodded. We've been waiting for you. She stepped into his arms and he held her like someone who knew exactly how to hold on. Outside, the world was waking. Inside, something was being born. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like the slow rising of dawn after a long, cold night. They were no longer just surviving. They were beginning again. The library was warm and bright, its high windows spilling golden light over rows of folding chairs. Paper leaves in shades of orange and red hung from the ceiling, gently swaying with every draft. At the front of the room stood a simple podium, a microphone, and a banner strung between two bookcases. Author Talk, Grace Whitmore. The Stories We Carry. Ethan sat in the second row. His hands clasped, a proud but subdued smile on his face. Lily sat beside him, legs swinging her new dress slightly wrinkled from fidgeting. She clutched a worn copy of Grace's first book in her lap. She looks like a movie star, Lily whispered when Grace stepped up to the podium. She looks like herself, Ethan whispered back. And she did. Grace stood with quiet confidence, dressed in a forest green dress that caught the light like late summer leaves. Her hair was down soft around her shoulders, and her smile, nervous but true, spread across the room like a fire catching kindling. Thank you all for being here. She began, her voice steadier than she felt. This town means more to me than most people know. I left it for a long time. I came back unsure if it would still have room for me. What I found instead was a place that had been holding space for me all along. There was a murmur of warmth from the audience. Familiar faces, strangers. A few wide-eyed teenage girls clutching journals. I want to share a little from my newest book, Grace said, opening the manuscript resting on the podium. It's called The Man Who Shared His Sandwich. It's not quite fiction, but it's also not exactly a memoir. It's a story about a girl who thought she was invisible, and the small act of kindness that changed the entire shape of her life. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, eyes steady on her. Grace read the opening lines, her voice weaving into the hush of the room. He didn't know her name. She didn't know what it felt like to be seen. But in the shadow of a gas station garage, he offered her half a sandwich. And for the first time in a very long time, she believed she might survive. There was a stillness that followed, one only stories could create, a stillness that felt sacred. Grace glanced up from the page and caught Ethan's eyes. This book is for anyone who's ever felt like their story didn't matter, and for the people who remind us that the smallest kindness, one we may not even remember giving, can become someone else's miracle. When the applause came, it was full and rich, rolling through the library. Like applause wasn't quite big enough for what people felt. Grace smiled and stepped back, cheeks flushed, heart full. After the talk, people lined up for book signings and conversations. Grace greeted each one with warmth, gratitude, and grace. But her eyes kept drifting to the corner of the room where Ethan stood, not rushing, simply waiting. Finally, when the last reader had left and the staff was folding chairs, she walked over to him. You stayed, she said, smiling. I always do, he replied, then held up a copy of her book. Will you sign it for me? She laughed and took the book, scrawling something quickly on the title page before handing it back. Ethan read it silently. For the man who gave more than he knew, and for the life we're still writing together. Love, Grace. He looked at her, emotion thick in his throat. I've never been in a book before. He said, you've always been in mine, she replied. They stepped outside into the crisp November air. Leaves danced across the library steps. The sky was streaked with fading sun, the kind of light that made ordinary things look holy. You know, Grace said, sliding her arm through his. I've been thinking, dangerous hush. She nudged him playfully. I want to open a writing studio, a small one. Maybe in that old brick building near the bakery. I could teach a few classes, maybe run a mentorship program. Ethan smiled. Think the town's ready for all that creative energy? I think this town is made for second chances, she said, and I'd like to be part of building some. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Cole's garage had 5 kids come by last week. One of them stayed after and asked if I could help him fix his mom's car. He didn't ask for money, just knowledge. Grace squeezed his arm. That's what building looks like. They walked down the sidewalk together, past shops with hand-painted signs, past neighbors waving from porches, past a town that had, without ceremony or fuss, taken them both back. As they reached the truck, Lily came bounding toward them from where she'd been showing her drawing to the librarian. She held a cupcake in one hand, her book tucked under her arm. Miss Grace, she said breathlessly, when I grow up, I want to write stories like you. Grace knelt down, cupping her face gently. You already are, Lily. Lily grinned. Can I help you at the new studio? Grace looked up at Ethan. She's hired, he said. That night at home, the 3 of them curled on the couch. A fire crackled in the hearth. Grace sat with her legs tucked under her. Lily snuggled between them, head heavy on Ethan's chest. The world outside faded into quiet. You know, Ethan murmured, brushing Grace's hair back from her temple. Claire used to say, life isn't about starting over. It's about continuing the story with new chapters. Grace smiled, resting her hand on his. Then I'm glad we're writing this one together. And with the warmth of family wrapped around them and the sound of Lily's breathing, steady and soft, Grace knew without doubt or fear that the next chapter was already unfolding. Not on a page, but in every moment they chose to love, to build, to stay. The orchard had always been Grace's favorite place on the property, even as a child. Nestled behind the main house, it stretched down a gentle slope, rows of apple trees lining the golden meadow, like sentinels of memory. In October, the trees wore red and gold, their fruit plump and fragrant. But now on this late November afternoon, most of the apples were gone, the last leaves clinging to the branches like old secrets. Grace stood at the top of the hill, basket in hand, a knit scarf wrapped snugly around her neck. A breeze played with the ends of her hair. From below, she could hear the faint sound of Lily laughing bright and clear as she chased a squirrel between 2 trees. Ethan was down there too, steadying a ladder against a bare branch, his silhouette outlined by the low sun. He glanced up at Grace and raised a hand shielding his eyes. You supervising or just admiring, he called. She smiled, lifting the basket. Somebody has to manage quality control, he chuckled, descending the ladder. His boots crunched through fallen leaves as he made his way toward her. You know, he said, brushing a leaf from his shoulder, I'm thinking of planting pear trees in the spring. Ambitious, Grace replied, handing him an apple. We're a community garage now, he said. Might as well have a community orchard. She took a bite of her apple and nodded in approval. I like the sound of that. He studied her for a moment, soft eyes, strong posture, the glow of someone who'd come home and stayed. It was still new in some ways, but it fit. She fit, not like someone who had returned, like someone who had always belonged. They sat on a nearby bench, the wood still warm from the afternoon sun. Lily ran up a moment later, cheeks pink from running curls bouncing. Miss Grace, she cried breathless, I found a perfect apple. It has a heart on it. Look, she held it up. Indeed, the shape of a heart, faint and natural, was etched in red along one side. Grace gasped. That's not just an apple, that's a wish apple. Lily's eyes grew wide. What do I wish for? Something brave, Ethan said, ruffling her hair. Something kind, Grace added. Lily closed her eyes, tight lips, moving silently. Then she tucked the apple carefully into her coat pocket and ran off again, humming to herself. Grace turned to Ethan, voice softer now. She's healing, you know. He nodded, we all are. For a moment they sat in stillness, not empty silence but full. Like the orchard itself was holding its breath around them, letting them rest. Ethan cleared his throat, eyes forward. Do you remember that first morning? You standing on the porch in those ridiculous heels? Grace laughed. I was trying to look composed, but my heart was beating out of my chest. You said you'd been waiting for me. I had, he turned toward her. What did you mean? She looked at him, then not just at the man who had fixed her gutters and baked pies with her daughter, but at the boy who had once offered a sandwich and expected nothing in return. I didn't come back to find myself, she said quietly. I came back to find you. Ethan's throat tightened. Grace. Wait. She interrupted, reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I was saving this. He took it from her hands and unfolded it carefully. It was a page from her manuscript, one she hadn't read aloud at the library event. He scanned the words. He didn't wear armor, he didn't need to, because when the world broke her, he didn't try to fix her. He just stayed, and that was enough. That was everything. He looked up, his eyes wet. That's me. She nodded. He folded the paper slowly, slipping it into his coat. I don't know what I did to deserve this. You were kind when it cost you nothing, she said. And then you were kind again when it meant everything. The wind moved through the trees, rustling branches, sending a few leaves spinning through the air like gold confetti. Ethan reached for her hand. You were worth the wait, he whispered. So were you, she replied. They sat there a long time, long after Lily had wandered back to the house. Long after the sun dipped low, shadows stretched across the orchard, cool and quiet. And just before they rose to follow the path home, Ethan stood and turned toward her. I've been waiting for you too, Grace. I just didn't know it until you were standing there telling me you'd been waiting. She stepped into his arms. No fanfare, no grand declarations, just warmth, truth. The kind of love that isn't loud but lasts. That evening, the three of them gathered around the dinner table in Grace's kitchen, the old house humming with life. Candles flickered. The scent of baked apples and rosemary chicken lingered in the air. Laughter punctuated the clatter of plates. It wasn't a special occasion, it didn't need to be, because sometimes the greatest miracles aren't in the big moments. They're in the everyday ones. In a sandwich shared behind a garage. In a child's laughter on an autumn afternoon. In a second chance you never saw coming, wrapped not in perfection, but in patience. And in a voice that finally says with a quiet certainty, I'm home. We'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. We read everyone, and it means so much to us to see this community from all over the world coming together through storytelling. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming tales about love, resilience, and the quiet power of kindness. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and take care of each other.